remind me to do if I forget. And you guys on Zoom can still hear me all right? Good, okay. All right, so yeah, let's talk about this one here for a second. So this was one of the hormone pathways we talked about last time. And this hormone pathway had to do with the adrenal gland, right, and the adrenal cortex. When we talked about the different adrenal hormones. And one of those, one of the groups of those was the mineralocorticoids, right? And the mineralocorticoid we talked about was this one, aldosterone. Okay, so aldosterone has it's not working, has a bunch of different stimuli. Oh, I can't use it because I'm just looking at it on a JPEG. I forgot. Let me do it like this. There we go. So yeah, talking about aldosterone there, and yeah, as with all the hormone loops, I want you to know the stimuli, right? So multiple stimuli for this one, for aldosterone. One of those would be high blood potassium, okay? And that aligns directly with one of its effects too, right? One of its effects was to cause us to excrete more potassium, okay? So if we got too much, it causes aldosterone, then we excrete more potassium, okay? The other one was angiotensin II. You know, angiotensin II is what we get from the whole renin system. Okay, so who remembers where renin is released from? Anybody in class? Yell it out if you remember. What organ did that come from? Kidneys? Yeah, perfect. So kidneys, we get renin release with low blood flow to the kidneys or low blood pressure to the kidneys. Then it releases renin. Okay, so that's this one, low BP or blood flow in the kidneys. Call them the kids for now. And yeah, and then what does that do? So it leads to the formation, back out of the way if I can, maybe I can put it up here or something, there we go. Formation of angiotensin II. That's really the importance of renin for us, is it's what causes the formation of angiotensin II. And then angiotensin II has a bunch of effects. Okay, one of the effects it has is to stimulate aldosterone release. It also stimulates ADH release. It also activates the sympathetic nervous system. It also causes vasoconstriction of blood vessels. And so it's doing a lot because of its ADH release that causes us to hold on to more water. Because of its stimulation of aldosterone, that's causing us to hold on to more sodium and release potassium. Okay, and then the other one was right here, ACTH. Remember when we experience stress, that activates the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases one of its hormones, you don't have to know the name of, but that causes the pituitary to release ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, right? So, and then it goes to the adrenal gland and causes the adrenal gland to release its hormones, and one of those is aldosterone, right? So that is those are the three different stimuli there for aldosterone. Okay, questions on that? All right, and you guys in the room, if I'm not being loud enough, then just tell me. That's always a problem I have in this room, and of course it's a little harder when I've got a mask on too. So yeah, give me some kind of a sign. Don't be shy to tell me I'm not talking loud enough if you're in one of the back corners. Okay. Okay. All right. So let's dive into this male reproductive system a little bit more here, and yeah, and for you guys on Zoom, feel free to put questions in the chat. And I will also try to, I'll try to kind of zoom in and zoom out because I like to walk around a little bit. And if I walk around, then you lose sight of me. So, so I'll probably, when I do zoom out, it might be because I want to walk around a little bit. Okay. And I will go ahead and pass this little attendance sheet out. So this is simple. This should have your name on it. Just sign. Maybe you can put the date on the top there for me. I forgot. Right there, just put the date. And then, so just sign in that first column next to your name. All right. Okay, so let's talk about just kind of the basics, and the video just kind of walked us through this here. The basics of mitosis versus meiosis, right? So gone through this in other biology classes before, I'm sure. But the idea here with mitosis is this is what's going to be happening in most of our the cells of our body. But then meiosis is a little bit different. We're only seeing this in the sex cells or in the gametes. Okay. we definitely get DNA replication before with both of these processes, okay? But the difference is meiosis, the cells divide twice, right? And so in the end, we end up, instead of with 2 cells at the end, like we do in mitosis, right here, right, we end up with 4, okay? And then the part about DNA replication doesn't happen twice, it only happens once. So what ends up happening is we get 4 cells with only 23 chromosomes instead of the 46. Okay, and that's what it showed in that video, right? We had the male side and the female side. Those came together in fertilization to then make the 46 chromosomes again. Okay, and that's kind of the basics of what I want you to know right here. Nothing really more than that. Okay, let's walk through just a little compare and contrast with these 2 processes. So which cells? This is mitosis is happening in somatic cells, just means all cells of the body pretty much, except for the gametes. And then meiosis is happening in the gamete cells, sperm cells and egg cells. Okay, the resemblance from the cells that show up at the end, the daughter cells versus the parent cells, in mitosis, they're genetically identical, right? Their DNA is exactly the same. But in meiosis, they're not. Okay, and we talked about that a little bit last semester when we talked about crossing over and some of those things. And yeah, so we won't go into that too much in detail this semester. Okay, daughter cells resemblance. Oh yeah, that one was out of order. Daughter cells resemblance to each other. Mitosis, they're the same. Meiosis, they're not. So we have 4 genetically unique cells in meiosis and 2 genetically identical cells in mitosis. Okay, so number of chromosomes versus daughter versus parent, same in mitosis, half in meiosis. And the purpose of each, well, the purpose of mitosis is just to grow new cells, really, right? It's either to replace damaged or old cells or for tissue to actually grow. Meiosis is obviously not that, it's for reproduction. And just as a couple reminders about all of us getting used to being back in the classroom together, a couple things I will kind of, when you're in the class, I will have you at a couple points maybe turn and just talk to somebody next to you. I don't really want you like scooting your chair next to them, but just turn your head. We might have a couple little discussions about questions here and there. So yeah, again, don't pull your chair up right up next to somebody, but you can kind of turn and talk. And then secondly, just make sure you're wearing your mask, of course, the whole time, but also wearing it up over your nose too. I know sometimes it slips down over your nose, but if you could just pull it up over your nose, that would be the proper way to wear it. So thank you. Okay, any questions about this so far? Okay. All right, so this just kind of recaps some of those things that we just talked about. So the daughter cells that are made have only 23 chromosomes. Okay, daughter cells made in mitosis have 23 pairs, but 46 total. But that, again, that number, that 46 chromosome number is, again, restored after fertilization because the 23 come from mom, 23 come from dad, and we're back up to 46 or 23 pairs. Okay. All right. So let's with that in the backdrop of the reproductive system, let's dive into some of the male specific reproductive system, and we'll start out with the anatomy and then jump into some of the physiology and the hormonal pieces to that here in a sec. Okay. So let's talk about development first. So during fetal life in males, the size of the stem cell population, those cells that are going to eventually create sperm cells, the stem cells are growing like crazy. It's a case of lots of mitosis, okay? So males are building up a colony of cells that can eventually start producing sperm, okay? And so these sperm stem cells are called spermatogonia, or that really just literally means sperm seeds, okay? But then when the male baby is born, this mitosis stops. Okay, so no more mitosis at that point, all the way up until puberty, and then that mitosis begins again. We start adding more cells to the testes in males, and then eventually those will eventually start becoming sperm as well. Okay, and this is going to be contrasted with what happens in females. In females, the mitotic part, or the part where females are building up more egg cells, is only happening in fetal life. And then once the female baby is born, then mitosis is stopped, and the number of eggs that were there at birth is the number of eggs that are there all the way up until puberty, until eggs start being released, and then that number is dropping slowly. So in males, it's totally different, right? It's just going, once puberty begins again, there's just many new cells being made continuously. Okay, so part of the development is the testes descending into the scrotum. Okay, and this typically happens before birth. Okay, yeah, just keep passing it that way. The attendance sheet, thanks. There are a couple, sometimes this can be a problem. Sometimes they don't actually descend all the way. And this can lead to infertility and some other problems. And what's supposed to happen is a spermatocord is supposed to pass all the way through this little canal that's shown up here called the inguinal canal. Okay. But sometimes the testes does descend, but the canal doesn't close up enough, and there's kind of a larger hole than there should be. And since the intestines are right there as well, upon applying a lot of force or putting a lot of abdominal pressure, sometimes the intestines can actually push through that hole down into the scrotum, and that's what an inguinal hernia is. So if you've heard of an inguinal hernia, it's a type of hernia, not the type of hernia that sticks out of your abdomen, but that literally goes down into the scrotum instead. And that can be repaired with some mesh kind of structure there to stop that. Okay, and then moving into puberty, adulthood, as I mentioned, the stem cells regenerate via mitosis, and then the cells start differentiating actually into sperm. And then they start getting into meiosis, and that's really where we get true sperm cells. Okay, questions on any of that so far? Okay. All right, so let's take a look at the male anatomy here. So the scrotum is really, it's continuous with the abdominal lining. Okay, so it's an out-pocketing of the abdominal lining. The purpose of it is because sperm do best at about 3 degrees below body temperature. Okay, so it actually needs to be, the testes need to live outside of the body in a way so they can be a little bit cooler. Okay, and this is where some problems with sometimes tight-fitting pants or hot tubs or different things like that can actually lead to fertility problems in some cases. Okay, there's 2 specialized muscles that actually aid in this process. So there's the first one there is called the cremaster muscle, shown right here, and that actually lifts the testes up closer to the body when the body gets a little bit colder. And then secondly, there's the dartos muscle that actually just takes the skin of the scrotum and pulls it all closer to the abdomen as well. So both of those muscles act kind of in conjunction with the temperature and can pull the testes closer to try to maintain the proper temperature. Okay. Any questions there in the chat or in the room? All right, so let's look at a little bit of the anatomy of the testes themselves. There's multiple layers. One of the layers is called the tunica albuginea. This is kind of this white protective layer that kind of goes all throughout the testes. We see something very similar in the female ovaries on next Monday. Did anybody not get the attendance sheet yet? We good? There we go. Right up here, Cam. Over there too. Okay. Go ahead. All right. Okay. Yeah. So this is what surrounds a structure called the seminiferous tubule. And this is just this collection of tubes that kind of have all kinds of little turns and twists in them. And there's cells lining the seminiferous tubule that are very important for helping the sperm develop. Okay, and then there's the epididymis. The epididymis is just a continuation of the tube system that we have in the seminiferous tubule. And it's a series of ducts in kind of the back part of the testes, and this is also where sperm become mature. So the development's kind of happening earlier, maturation is happening here, and really this is, in a funny way to say it, becoming modal, but they're learning how to swim pretty much, right? They're taking their swim lessons here and getting ready to go. And then the ductus deferens, also known as the vas deferens, is where these two, is again, continuing on this same tubular system here. And this is what's going to head all the way up into the abdominal cavity. And the vas deferens is involved in the ejaculation process because it's all lined with smooth muscle. And so when ejaculation occurs, the smooth muscle contracts and pushes all of that sperm towards the penis. Okay, so let's take a second here and just label those structures that I was just talking about there. And then I'll also open up this question on the app, and you can answer that question: where would be the initial site of sperm production? Okay, and yeah, feel free to just look to one person to the side of you or behind you, and just kind of double check your answers. And with Zoom, I'm going to try to, at some point, maybe not with this one, maybe with the next one, I'm going to try to send you to breakout rooms. I didn't set it up perfectly, so you're with everybody from your team, but I'll try to make it so you've got at least one person in a breakout room with you. Okay. So take a second, fill that in. Go ahead.
Do the cremaster, cremaster, does that help in ejaculation?
No.
No.
So yeah, just label those structures. And again, I encourage you to actually write it in right now instead of waiting for me to uncover the answers. It's always better to make that choice yourself, whether it's right or wrong. You'll actually learn something by making the choice instead of just rotely copying down the answer when it pops up. All right, so go ahead and send in your answer there on the app if you haven't yet. Only about half of you have. All right, give you about 5 seconds to send it in. All right. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and shut that off. All right, so where's the initial site of sperm production? So we're either between C or D for the most part. But if you think about it, it's really just going to be kind of the most interior part, really the start of this tubular system, right? So where is that? That's starting back in here, right? That's really the beginning point, and then they're going to make it through all these little tubes, go through this part, through here, and then eventually connect all the way over here and back up this way, that way, right? So it's kind of this long path. But yeah, yeah, so let's see the different ones here. So the spermatocord is the top part. B is the vas deferens. C is the seminiferous tubule, and D is just is kind of the membrane that protects everything. So yeah, so C was the correct answer there, which would be the seminiferous tubule. Okay, any questions on that? So a lot of other things there labeled that you don't need to know, but definitely need to know the ones that were on the previous slide.
The spermatocord, is that just like protects all the nerves and stuff?
Yeah, so it's really more of like a tube that holds onto the vas deferens, but also holds onto blood vessels, nerves, all of that. So the nerves are passing through as well as both artery and vein structures are passing through. All right, good question. Any other questions? Don't be shy on the chat. You're here with us too. All right. Okay, so let's look at the next level of anatomy here as we're still making our way up towards the abdominal, into the abdominal cavity next. We've got a couple of different ducts here. So the ejaculatory duct, this is where the vas deferens and the seminal vesicle meet. Okay, so this is before we get to the urethra. Okay, this is again a wall that's lined with smooth muscle, again plays a role in ejaculation. Okay, the urethra is a duct that is both for semen and urine together. Okay, so before that, the two pathways were separate, right? It was reproductive system pathway, urinary pathway were two separate tubes, but at this point they come together and now there's a shared pathway. Okay, so the seminal vesicle, this sits back behind the bladder, and 70% of the volume of semen is actually produced by this structure here. Okay, so it releases this fluid that has a very high pH, very alkaline fluid, but also contains sugar, contains fructose. Okay, and the reason for this is the fructose is literally there to feed the sperm, to give them energy so they can keep producing energy in their mitochondria to drive their tails, right? And then the alkaline is to neutralize the typically acidic environment in the vagina. Okay, and then the prostate gland is right behind the bladder, or sorry, right underneath the bladder, and it surrounds the urethra completely. So the urethra kind of goes right through it. Okay, it secretes kind of this thin, slightly acidic fluid that we have no idea what the purpose really is. And so the reason, yeah, so when somebody has prostate cancer, typically that can be removed without any major side effects by losing the prostate, but there can typically be other side effects of the surgery, but not because you don't have a prostate, but more because of the surgery itself. And then the bulbourethral gland is a little pea-sized gland sitting inferior to the prostate that secretes more of a thick, clear mucus. This is for lubrication and neutralizing the pH of the urethra prior to ejaculation. So this fluid isn't typically part of semen, comes out before. All right, so let's take a second and label those structures. And if you're ready, you can go to the next page there and start labeling those structures. I'll go back here. Everybody's still writing that? And I'll go ahead and open up the clicker question there again. And you can go ahead and send in the answer of that question. You know what? Let me try that again on the clickers so we can do, so you can have more than just A through E. Okay, so again, feel free to talk to the person next to you to just verify that you're on the same page. Interesting part about the prostate gland is it grows continuously through all of life. And you can see if it just kept getting bigger and bigger, how the urethra goes right through it. You can see how that could easily make it hard to urinate. And this is why older men have a hard time urinating, is because it just gets smashed down after a while. Guys aren't talking much. I know our first 2 days in face-to-face class, first one I got to talk about cheating, the second one we're talking about the reproductive system, but whatever. It's fine. All right, so at least check with somebody around you whether you got the same answer for the question there. All right, anybody else want to send their answer in there? Is that everybody? Okay, gonna shut that off. Emmy had a good question on the chat there. If maybe the pH of the vagina could ever be a problem with conception, if a couple is having a hard time getting pregnant. I've never heard of that being the issue. I don't think that's the common issue. You know who would be a great person to ask that question to is Dr. Silva. For those of you that have a lab with Dr. Silva, I don't know if he told you his career story, but he was really a fertility specialist in Wisconsin for most of his career. So he's done lots of surgeries on women, at least, to try to correct problems in the uterine tubes and things like that. And so I'm sure he would know a lot more about that than me, but it's a great question, Emmy. I haven't heard of that specific problem being the problem with conception, but I'm not that well versed on it either. Okay, let's see what you guys said. Good, so most of you are saying A for the answer here. So which is seminal vesicle? A, yep, got it. Okay, and then B is the ejaculatory duct. Okay, we can see, so this part here is still purely reproductive system, but then since this is the bladder, that's the little part of the urethra coming down. So once we get to this part here, this is where we actually have shared space between the reproductive and urinary systems. Okay, so C is the prostate gland. D is that bulbourethral gland. So this little guy here. Okay, and then E is the vas deferens, the ductus deferens. And then F is the urethra. Okay. Any other questions on that so far? All right. Everybody got this? I'll give you another 20 seconds to finish writing that down. All right, let's move on. So the next anatomy part here is the anatomy of the penis. There's really three primary regions to it: the root, the body, and the glands. Okay, the glands is covered by the foreskin, but the scientific term is the prepuce. Okay, so this is part of what's removed during circumcision. Interesting part about circumcision in America, it's definitely common. Over half of American boys are circumcised, but worldwide, it's very, very uncommon. Only about 15% of boys worldwide, including the American numbers, get circumcised. So it's extremely uncommon throughout the world. So much so that insurance companies don't cover it anymore. So if you want to get it done on your baby boy, you got to pay for it out of pocket, because there's really no scientific evidence to prove that it is helpful as far as health goes at this point. So interesting fact. So the kind of unique portion of the anatomy of the penis is the vascular part. And so there's some large deep central arteries in the center, and those are surrounded by sinuses, which are pretty much like veins, but they're kind of these big veins that can flatten out. And so with erection, the parasympathetic nervous system leads to the release of a chemical called nitric oxide. And we'll talk a lot more about nitric oxide at the very end of the semester. We're talking about cardiovascular disease, because it's a very important factor in cardiovascular disease. Where have some of you heard of nitric oxide before? Some of those pre-workout drinks, probably, right? Yeah, exactly, right? It's like NO explode and all those different things. Yeah, it's a vasodilator, right? That's what it is. It's a vasodilator. It causes your blood vessels to open up, so it would increase blood flow to a certain area. Okay, and so that's really what drives this process of erection. Okay, so that dilates the arteries, and by doing that, that pushes blood into these big sinuses, which are like big veins. And as long as the arteries are still dilated, the blood is just stuck in there pretty much, right? And so that smashes down the drainage part of the veins, so the blood can't exit, okay? Erectile dysfunction is super common. About literally half, 50% of men over the age of 40 suffer from some level of erectile dysfunction, okay? And typically this is caused by some kind of damage to the artery walls, typically the cells called endothelial cells that line the blood vessels, that would be lining some of these blood vessels we're talking about. Their job is to make the nitric oxide. If they're not functioning properly, they don't make enough nitric oxide, and we don't get the same level of vasodilation, And one thing that I added to the slides a couple of years ago, as I became aware of the incredible epidemic of pornography in our country, but even on this campus as well, is that a very common problem these days for people who have used pornography throughout their childhood and into their adulthood is called porn-induced erectile dysfunction, pornography-induced, and pretty much it's kind of just rewires your brain in such a way that you can really only get an erection if you see some very extreme things that you've been used to seeing in pornography, to the point so much that when you actually get to have sex with your wife or whatever it might be, that doesn't do it, right? That doesn't actually lead to an erection because your brain's so kind of strangely wired for pornography instead. This is becoming a very common problem and a very common reason for erectile dysfunction in our country. So it's a sad thing for sure. So the treatment of this, we've all seen way too many of the commercials, right? Cialis, Viagra. What those do is those increase the effects of nitric oxide. So those kind of enhance the effects of nitric oxide. And that drug was being studied as a cardiovascular disease drug. And they noticed some men were getting erections lasting longer than 4 hours while they're on this drug, right? That's always the thing in the commercial, right? And they're like, well, that's not something we expected. And all of a sudden it became marketed as a erectile dysfunction drug instead of a cardiovascular disease drug. So, okay, any questions about any of that? Okay. All right, so we can just walk through this one together here. So the labeling part, just those three regions, the root, the shaft, and the glands. And then the foreskin or the prepuce over here, okay? And then this is kind of looking at that vascular anatomy. I was talking about the deep arteries there, kind of in the center of all the, so the red would be the arterial blood and the blue would be the venous blood. So they're just surrounded by the sinuses. And that's what F is, it's all those different blood sinuses that fill up with blood and the blood gets stuck in there during erection. Thank you. Good question. I mean, no, erectile dysfunction drugs. I think if you use them, not outside of the prescripted levels and things like that, they can be damaging. But no, they don't have any super common side effects on the heart. Good question. Okay. Any other questions on the anatomy here before we move on to a little bit more of the physiology? Okay. All right. Okay, so a little bit about the contents of semen. Okay, so semen is typically somewhere between 2 and 5 milliliters of fluid per ejaculation. Okay, only about 10% of that is sperm. Okay, so there's about somewhere between 20 and 150 million sperm per milliliter of semen. Okay, and so if you do the math, somewhere at least 300 million is what the video said, but it can be more than that, right? If it's 5 milliliters of sperm, it can be 5 times 150, right? Which would be way more than that. Okay, so just so many sperm in one ejaculation. All right, so all the different components of it. Number one, there's acid buffers, again, to neutralize the urethra and vagina, as we talked about. Also important for kind of destroying any bacteria that could be damaging to the sperm. Fructose, as we already talked about, to provide fuel for the sperm in their mitochondria to produce ATP. Prostaglandins, and we talked about stimulating uterine contractions before, but another chemical that stimulates uterine contractions is prostaglandins. And prostaglandins will bind to the uterus and to the cervix and cause it to contract a little bit, which actually helps the sperm to move upwards to their destination. Okay, and it's also what I mentioned before about as a possible way to stimulate labor during pregnancy. Okay, and then there's also clotting factors in here as well, which helps the semen to stick to the walls of the vagina instead of being kind of rushed out with the rest of the fluid. Okay, so the kind of just unique part here is that I mentioned before that erection was caused by the parasympathetic nervous system, but then the ejaculation process is a sympathetic process. So it's kind of this mixing of parasympathetic and sympathetic. We'll talk more about those processes on Friday when we talk about the autonomic nervous system. So the very common surgery called a vasectomy. So vas, we're talking about the vas deferens, right? And ectomy just means you're removing something from the body. Okay, so removing part of the vas deferens is what a vasectomy is, right? So people that are done having kids, don't want to have kids anymore, can have this elective surgery, which is typically either a cutting and or tying of the vas deferens. Typically they'll go into that spermatocord, pull out the vas deferens, slice a little chunk out of it, and then cauterize both ends or tie off both ends on both sides, obviously. So there's just no path for sperm to make it to the urethra anymore. So extremely effective birth control, so much so that it's known more as sterilization than it is as birth control, right? But it's only about 50% of the time you can reverse it. So got to know you're ready for that. Because only about half the time if they want to get it reversed, sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't. So, okay. Any questions on any of that? All right. Okay, so just a little bit more on this process of spermatogenesis. And spermatogenesis, again, is the formation of sperm. Kind of talked about the structures that it happens in. And so we can see this process here. Starting up here is where the mitosis happens, and then moving into meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, eventually to form these 4 sperm cells, that just started with one stem cell, spermatogonia cell. Okay, so you don't have to necessarily memorize anything in these steps here. A couple things I do want you to understand, though, are these cells. So there's a couple important cells there that are important for this process. Number one is called the Sertoli cells, also known as the sustentacular cells. They're kind of known as the nurse cells of the sperm. They kind of take care of the sperm, help them develop, help them mature. Okay, they secrete substances that just aid in the growth and development of sperm. Okay, but then they also form the blood-testis barrier. Okay, and the reason we need a blood-testis barrier is because the genetic makeup of sperm cells is different than that of the host of the male cell, right? The rest of the male cells, and so the immune system, if it interacts with a sperm cell, it'll destroy it, right? And so we need to have that barrier between the blood that contains immune cells and the sperm. Okay, and then secondly, there's these Leydig cells, also known as interstitial cells. And in the female ovaries, we'll see kind of 2 types of cells that look somewhat similar to these two. And these are around the seminiferous tubules, and their big job is to secrete testosterone. So this is where the majority of testosterone comes from in males, these Leydig cells. Okay, so just definitely want to know those two cell types and what they do. And in a second here, I'll show you which of the 2 hormones that we talked about before, LH or FSH, stimulates each of these cells, and that'll be another important point for these 2 cells. Okay, so let's talk about these hormones in the male reproductive system. So LH, and one thing to note is the names of these 2 hormones are given for what they do in females, not for what they do in males. Okay, luteinizing hormone is LH, and that its job is to, in females, is to cause ovulation, which is, we'll talk about next week, which forms something called the corpus luteum. So that's why it's called a luteinizing hormone. Has nothing to do with what it does in males. Its job in males is to stimulate those Leydig cells, causing them to release testosterone. And then FSH is, the full name is follicle stimulating hormone. The follicles exist in females, not in males. The follicle is what surrounds the egg. Okay, and its big job in females is to stimulate the follicle to grow before ovulation happens. And so again, not what it does in males, but what it does in males is stimulate those Sertoli cells to release certain chemicals, the same chemicals we were just talking about that are important for sperm development. Also, to release a hormone called inhibin, which is important for kind of giving some negative feedback to the release of testosterone and some of these other hormones. Okay, and then testosterone, important for sperm development and male sex characteristics. And then inhibin, like I just said, negative feedback and controls the rate of sperm production. So GnRH, that's not one you have to know. I just still have that in the slides. That's the hypothalamic hormone that starts this whole process. Again, you can just know that as a hypothalamic hormone. Okay, so what I'd like to do for a sec is have you work through this male sex hormone control loop here. And so again, you're kind of filling in the numbers and then just answering these couple questions here, okay? And so on the Zoom, I'd like to try to send you guys to breakout rooms. Again, you won't have everybody from your team, and there'll be a couple, one group that has nobody from their team. It'll just have some other people. So let's try that. Let's go a couple minutes at this. And so those of you in the class, I'd love for you to chat with each other a little bit about this, walk through this, make sure you understand it. So go ahead. Yeah, and I will open up the app there, and you can answer that question. Where is testosterone released? That'll be a number. Hi. Yeah, so fill in what's going on each step. See maybe about a quarter of you actually writing, the other 3/4 waiting. But yeah, fill it in. Think about what's going on. Talk to somebody next to you. Either go just right next to you or turn around and look who's behind you and chat with that person.
So would 3 be the? Maybe 4 is like, maybe, yeah, 4 would be like LA, because that would then stimulate really big cells. And then FSH.
All right, so you're just sending in a number on your app there for that first question, where is testosterone released? If you guys are just coming back on Zoom from your breakout rooms, make sure you send in your answer there. Where is testosterone released? Having some good conversations, some of those teams. We'll let them have their whole time. All right, now they're coming. All right, yeah, so send that in if you haven't yet. So you're gonna put a number in here for where's testosterone released. Let's take a look at what you guys said there. Okay, so about a little over half of you, 60% almost, are saying 5. Okay, so yeah, so somewhere around here is what it's looking like, and that makes sense because it's connecting right to some of the effects of testosterone. Okay, so let's walk through this. So number one is the hypothalamus releasing a hormone, right? And we didn't talk about what that was. I did, but it's not one you have to know. So the hypothalamic hormone's released. Okay, that's going to go down to number 2 there, and you can't really necessarily tell which one is 2 and which one is 4. But it is important, again, to connect which hormone stimulates which of those 2 cell types, right? So number 2 is our FSH, and FSH is going to help us stimulate sperm development. And which cell type was that it FSH stimulated? Out of those 2, we had the Leydig cells and the Sertoli cells, right? The Sertoli ones, right? Yeah, so the Sertoli cells are stimulated to release chemicals that help in the development of sperm. Okay, then we'll go back up to 4. 4 is our LH. 4 is going to go to those Leydig cells, or LH is going to go to those Leydig cells and cause testosterone release, as most of you said. So 5 would be the right answer to that one for sure. Okay, and then we see some negative feedback provided in 2 separate ways. All right, so we see some negative feedback provided by testosterone itself, and then we see some negative feedback provided by inhibin. Okay, testosterone has 3 broad actions. We've got growth. It's an anabolic hormone, so number 1 is growth. Okay, number 2, sperm development, and number 3, sex characteristics. Okay, so those would be the 3 broad effects of testosterone. Okay, and we just got one more slide, so we'll finish this one up here. Any questions about this before I move on? So there's just growth, sperm development, and sex characteristics. Okay, just real quick about anabolic steroids. I kind of mentioned this already. Typically, that's either going to be testosterone itself, but more recently, it's been those precursors, those androgens that we talked about before. A couple of the problems with that: hypothalamus senses high testosterone. So what does it do? That's negative feedback, right? If we got a lot of testosterone, that tells the hypothalamus to stop releasing its hormone, which tells the pituitary to stop releasing these. But testosterone is not the only thing that ends up coming out when we do all of that, right? So that's why males that take testosterone have infertility, because they're not releasing enough LH, they're not releasing enough FSH, and so they're not developing sperm. They're not maintaining their blood testis barrier. There can actually be permanent damage to the testicles by breaking down of the blood testis barrier completely. It makes sense, right? Because if you're given way too much negative feedback for no reason, then you're not getting the other effects of LH and FSH. Okay. All right. And these are just a bunch of side effects of the anabolic steroid use, and that's the one I just explained there. Cardiovascular disease, there's too much growth of the heart, as well as cholesterol, incredible acne, ulcerated acne. Gynecomastia is the one I mentioned before, which is breast growth in males, which is shown here. Emotional changes, liver damage, and that incredible acne, just to name a few of those side effects. So, all right, guys, that's it. So any questions on that? All right, well, have a good day in lab tomorrow, and we'll see all you guys on Zoom on Friday for our next TBL day. Okay, so make sure you come ready for that. We'll see you guys then.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. Have a good day.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Thank you. Bye-bye.